tomorrow. You guys are going to start a play called The Crucible. It's based on some of the characters you've been studying. They're real life people. They're set in this fictional play, but it's based on real events. It's based on the Salem witch trials, which happened in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1600s. And I want to give you a little bit of background to this historical event, and so take some notes. The Salem witch trials started off mysteriously. One morning, several girls in different homes woke up with seizure-like symptoms in the same morning, and they began accusing people in town of witching them, of coming to them in the middle of the night and setting spells on them. And so they would bring these people who they accused in front of court, and if the girls started shaking violently, falling down and fainting in court, then the people they accused would be automatically condemned of being witches and put on trial for hanging. Let's take a look at the Puritan community here. And please write this down in your notebook. You can pause as much as you want this video to give you time to write things down. The Puritans, what that means is any person seeking purity. So these were people from England who wanted freedom, religious freedom from the Church of England. And so they got on their boats and they crossed the Atlantic, came to this part of the world, and they settled in what is now Massachusetts. This was between 1620 and 1640. As a people, they did what they needed to survive. They were very strict in their lifestyle and legalistic. They were very smart in general. They emphasized education. They were very well read and learned. They educated everyone. They educated the boys and girls, which was unusual for that time period. They also emphasized family and community. If you grew up in a Puritan community, you pretty much lived there your whole life, sometimes not even traveling very far at all in your life. Women after school sometimes got jobs before they got married as nannies, and that becomes important in our play when they were 16, 17, 18 years old. But then they were expected to get married, and they basically stayed at home and didn't work. So this is just the general lifestyle of the Puritans as a bit of background. Just a few visuals, the way they dressed, what a typical house looked like, a village that still is in existence today. Of course, there are Puritans that live there, but they've preserved this throughout the centuries. Okay, most of this slide you don't have to write down. I'll tell you the very last one, though. You do. So this is what happened in Salem, which was one of the biggest communities of Puritans during that time. 1629, it was settled. In 1641, 12 years later, English law, and remember, these are English citizens, not Americans. English law makes witchcraft a capital punishment. Capital means punishable by death. So if you were accused and convicted of being a witch, you would be put to death. And usually that was hanging in this part of the world. 1660, a guy named Oliver Cromwell was more friendly to the Puritans, was replaced by Charles II, who was not. 1689, he declared that the colonies may not self-govern, so they had to report back to England. And then in 1692, write this down, Samuel Parris becomes the minister in Salem. And that is what starts the whole witchcraft thing off. Okay, we've been talking about the 1600s. Now we're going to fast forward for 250 years to the mid-1900s. And I want you to try to think about anything you know about what was happening in the mid-1900s during this time, okay? So this next slide of notes isn't when the story was set, but is when it was written. And this is just as important as when it was set. So I want you to write this next set of notes down in your notebooks again. So in the 1950s, World War II had just ended, and we entered into a time of what was known as the Cold War, which really lasted all the way up until the late 1980s. And the Cold War was really between two superpowers and the rest of the countries that fell in with them. One was the United States, which represented capitalism and democracy, and the other was the Soviet Union, which represented socialism and communism. And you don't really have to know what those mean, but just know that this was a time of really heightened tensions People were scared in both countries. The United States had just dropped an atomic weapon, and they knew that we had lots more of those, and we knew that they did too. In fact, they had nuclear subs in the water pointed at some of our big cities, and we did to theirs. And so this was the time, no shots were ever fired, which was why it was called the Cold War, but it was a time of fear. People during this time walked around not really knowing what the next day would bring. In fact, I had a teacher who during this time period was in second grade, and she had to wear dog tags to school as a second grader in case the school got bombed and they would have to sift through the rubble and find who was there. So it became known as the Red Scare. Red was the color of communists, and people in our country were scared of communists, not just across the seas, but infiltrating and living as spies in our own community. Of this, a senator named Joseph McCarthy saw an opportunity, and McCarthy knew that people are motivated by fear, and so he began accusing politicians of being communist, and he gained more and more power as he did that. These became known as witch hunts in American institutions, as people were looking for communists who probably didn't exist. And when I say American institutions, I mean two things: politics and Hollywood. They began looking for communists among actors and producers and directors. And one of these was a guy named Arthur Miller. And Arthur Miller was the most famous playwright of the day. And playwrights aren't very famous now. This is Arthur Miller, but he was very, very famous then. He was married to Marilyn Monroe for a time. And he was dragged in front of a committee and said, "We know that you have communist friends. Name everybody who you know who's communist, or you're going to jail." And he refused. And out of that, he wrote this play that we're going to read called The Crucible. So, what I want you guys to think about now for a minute with a partner is, what are some similarities between the two time periods? The 1600s with the witch trials when people were afraid of witches, and the 1950s when people were afraid of communists. And we'll start reading the play tomorrow.